When I was a kid in the 1970s, there was a common theory about how the world would progress. Basically, the population would keep expanding to the point where there just wasn't enough food to feed everybody. But that never happened. The world population is at 7 billion, and it's actually leveling off as things develop. I mean, what changed? The most important thing is that food distribution networks became global. The food that existed in places like the United States, the greatest exporter of food, became available to people all around the world. And it was a matter of developing the distribution networks more than anything else. It wasn't about a lack of capacity for food. And during that time, nations found a way to lift themselves up. It started with Japan in the 1970s, but has gradually worked its way through primarily what we would call the Asian tigers. But it's happening all around the world. There is a step by step process for developing a nation. It starts with heavy industry and it works its way up to gradually developing skills. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the things we're going to see in this virus, and if you're watching this in the future, is that there is a global shortage of food, especially in the developing world. If you're watching in the future, you've probably seen stories of developed countries having just terrible food shortages. That's only going to get worse. And I want to talk about why this is going to have ramifications for the distant future for a lot of reasons. And it has to do with the development of countries as they go. And I think the best example is a country that's sort of in the middle of the process right now. That's why I have this thousand rupiah Indonesian note, because Indonesia is an absolutely fascinating country. It's in the middle of the Asian tiger kind of situation. It's been working really hard to develop. Now, Indonesia is a series of islands. It's very difficult to build roads and bridges and things like that and connect all of the people in this incredibly diverse landscape, diverse culture, diverse languages. Plus, they have things like volcanoes and typhoons all the time. And, well, this nation of 260 million people, that's right, it's about two-thirds of the United States, uh, has a problem that the largest city and capital, Jakarta, is settling into the land and the sea level is rising. They've recently decided that this city of 30 million people in the metropolitan area needs to be relocated. I mean, a tremendous number of disadvantages, and yet, for all of it, Indonesia has gradually made progress. Since their sharp turn away from communism in the 1960s, didn't always go great, but it's been making steady progress and they're really taking care of business. And it all kind of comes down to the rupiah. See, Indonesia tries its best to be self sufficient. It has restrictions on the amount of food that can be imported, and the government kind of runs everything. And the system that they have in place has been, well, working fairly well for them. It, what it comes down to for them is that despite all of the disadvantages, they have one major advantage in the world, and that is oil, which recently became worth almost nothing. So it's going to be difficult for Indonesia. Fortunately, they also have a lot of growing economy based on the second most valuable cash crop that's traded around the world, and that's coffee. So, what is it about this development process? Why is it so difficult? Why does it take so many steps? And for that matter, why was it impossible for the developed world to see how it would go back in the 1970s? Well, the answer is that when you have, say, an authoritarian government that has tight control over everything, you don't need much in the way of infrastructure. You don't need institutions that take care of business and so on. Everything comes from the top, right? And when we say infrastructure, we don't just mean roads and bridges and things like that. We mean the systems, the institutions, the skills of people that are built up. Infrastructure is a very big thing, from concrete to trucks to, most importantly, the skills of people. And this takes time. It's sort of a step by step process. We saw Japan rise in the 1970s. We saw South Korea, which started in the 1970s, still ravaged from civil war, suddenly in the 1990s make a big breakout and turn the corner and become a developed nation, Gangnam style. The rich neighborhood of Seoul is incredible. So, how does this work? And how does this work for a country like Indonesia? Well, for all of their disadvantages, they're doing things quite well, to be honest with you. It's never perfect, but this is going to put them to the test. Now, food distribution networks are remarkably brittle. They tend to not be very resilient. That's the problem. See, if you remember in the Arab Spring in 2011, uh, in Egypt, they overthrew the government of Mubarak. In Syria, a civil war started. What was that all about? Well, what happened was there was a financial crisis. And Egypt, which imports 60% of its food, suddenly couldn't feed the people. And if history teaches autocrats three things, basically, that are consistent throughout all of history, okay? These three things are pay the army, feed the people, don't invade Russia. Okay. But that's what's important if you're an autocratic nation. To get all the way through this infrastructure development and break out to the other side of a developed nation is a process that takes steps. And the reason I'm mentioning Indonesia is not that they are going to be struggling particularly during this whole crisis. No, we're going to see horror stories in parts of the developed world where the food network really breaks down. The reason why Indonesia is important to watch is that the government has a system in place that is highly centralized. You might call it socialized, for lack of a better word. But honestly, this is how things have to progress from one step to another. You have to start with this top down kind of structure. Yes, it can be inefficient, bureaucratic, difficult. It doesn't make decisions quickly. But it's what you have to do when you're starting something from scratch and you have 260 million bellies to fill. All right? This is just the way you have to do it. During this crisis, a lot of these systems are going to break down. We have seen that in the United States. Parts of the world, they're going to fail completely. I want to focus on countries like Indonesia, where the systems should not fail, they should not break down, but they might because of extreme stress. This is how you will know how terrible things have gotten. Is a country like Indonesia suffering? And more importantly, does this set them back on this progress that they have been making, slow and steady, despite all of the difficulties of their geography and everything else? It's very important. See, in the 1970s, back when we thought that everybody would just sort of starve to death, it wasn't known how the world would ever come together. I mean, it required the United States to have this leadership, right? We had to be in charge of things. Well, that proved to simply not be true. By going through the process, which we could describe as the Asian tiger model, for lack of a better thing, nations found a way to take care of themselves. And many have indeed turned the corner. We need to be cheering for every nation to turn that corner. And at some point, we need to find a way to turn over the power so that they can be part of the whole system. The United States doesn't need to take care of everything. It doesn't mean we simply withdraw from the world. It means that we work together to make it happen. China is a special case. It's a centralized authoritarian government, and it's huge. China is always going to be difficult. Indonesia is very large, and it's taking care of business. It's doing a good job. Now, their democracy does not look just like the United States, and it never will. It's a Muslim country, it's extremely diverse, it has its own issues, it has its own things. But it does tend to take care of business. What more do you want, right? This is what we need to watch out for as the virus progresses. There will be terrible food shortages all around the world. But how much will this set countries back that are otherwise pretty much doing the right thing? Because 260 million mouths to feed is a lot. And this is what I want to keep an eye on during the whole crisis. Thank you.